Network is the American Family Radio Talk Network. Great to have you in the conversation today. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the president's ignorance of homosexuality and Jim Wallace's ignorance of the Second Amendment. Now, you know who Barack Obama is. He's the president of the United States. And by the way, Mark Stein pointed out the good news yesterday. He said, look, the good news is we're halfway home now. We're over the hump. We are in now to the final 4 years of President Obama's reign as King George Barack III. So we're over halfway home now. We're past noon on Wednesday, heading to Friday. The end is in sight, just 4 long years to go. So we have reason to think, well, you know, if we made it the first 4 years, we can make it for the next 4. American people are a very resilient people, and I think our mettle is going to be proved in this circumstance. Now, the problem here with Barack Obama is what he said yesterday in his inauguration speech. I'm not going to replay the soundbite for you. We played it yesterday. But here is what President Obama said yesterday. Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like everyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well. Now, I'm going to get to the sort of sinister part of this analogy or this comparison that President Obama makes. But first of all, we need to say, look, we are for every homosexual being treated as equal before the law. I am for that. I want every constitutional right that homosexuals possess. I want those rights to be protected for them, just like I want them for everybody else. I want them to have freedom of speech. I want them to have freedom of religion. I want them to have freedom of the press. I want them to have the freedom to petition the government for the redress of grievances. I want them to have the right of self-defense under the Second Amendment. I want them to have the right to a trial by a jury of their peers. I want them to have the right to confront their accusers in open court. I want them to have the right to be protected from cruel and unusual punishment. So I believe in equality of the law for homosexuals, just like I do for everybody else. However, homosexuals do not have a constitutional right to engage in sodomy. They do not have a constitutional right to make whatever sexual choices they want to make. You know, sodomy, the kind of sexual activity that homosexuals engage in, that was a felony offense in America for the first 200 plus years of our existence. So it's absurd in the extreme. It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous for homosexuals to claim that they have some kind of constitutional right to engage in sexually deviant behavior. They don't. They have no more right to engage in sodomy than pedophiles have to engage in their sexual practices, that those who would like to engage in incest have a right to engage in their kind of practices, or people who want to have sex with animals. They don't have a right to do that under the Constitution. So that's the first thing we need to clear up. Where they have legitimate constitutional rights, we want those protected. I want them protected for everybody, regardless of their sexual preference. However, when President Obama says they're created equal and therefore they have a right to engage in the kind of sexual behavior they want, this is completely bogus. It is a totally fallacious line of reasoning for one simple reason. All men are created equal, but nobody is created gay. Nobody's born that way. So men are created equal, but none of those men are created gay. That's a sexual preference. That has to do with the sexual choices they make. And so President Obama is betraying here an appalling level of ignorance about genetics and about biology. We've been over this before. I've got a column up to this effect up on rightlyconcerned.com talking about Obama being ignorant about homosexuality, and he just is. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So, and it's embarrassing, really, for him to betray this level of ignorance before the entire world. But you and I have talked about this before. You now know far more about this than the President of the United States. We have talked about this before, that even gay activists now have given up basically on the born gay deal. They've given up on that. I mean, they'll say it, but they won't defend it because they realize scientifically you cannot do it. We've talked about this before, but again, it bears repeating. If people are born gay, then the concordance rate between identical twins ought to be 100%, because that's how it works. They have the identical DNA. If it's genetically inherited, then if one twin is homosexual, the other ought to be a homosexual 100% of the time, because that's how it works with identical twins. One of them's got red hair, the other one's got red hair. One of them's got green eyes, the other one's got green eyes. That's how identical twins work. But everybody knows now, geneticists will tell you, look, we know now, we're backing away from that gay gene theory because we know now that the concordance rate among identical twins is actually very, very low. And I've mentioned this research before. Peter Bierman of Columbia and Hannah Bruckner of Yale. These are not members. They're not on the staff at the AFA. They're not on the staff at Focus on the Family. Not on the staff at Family Research Council. They're researchers at Columbia and Yale. And they used data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. And here's what they discovered. They discovered that the concordance rate, rather than being 100%, is just 6.7% for male identical twins, and it's just 5.3% for female identical twins. So this argues very powerfully that nurture and not nature is responsible, has a decisive role in shaping sexual preference. So the president, all he was doing yesterday was betraying his abysmal scientific ignorance of basic biology and genetics. And it's a shame that he demonstrated that ignorance to the entire world. Now, Jim Wallace is shifting gears a little bit. Jim Wallace he calls himself an evangelical, but he hardly has evangelical theology. He was out yesterday in a column saying that people who support the Second Amendment, he was particularly talking about Wayne LaPierre, but he would be talking about any Christian who supports the Second Amendment. And he said support for the Second Amendment, this is his quote, is morally mistaken, theologically dangerous, and religiously repugnant. But Jim Wallace does not speak for all evangelicals, and he is the one who is theologically misguided, and he is dangerously misguided on this score, because the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the Second Amendment, is rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Christianity is not a pacifist religion. You know, Exodus 15:3 describes Yahweh as a man of war. That's how he is described. There's an entire section of Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 8 about praying for God's direction when he directs them to go to war. When God directs them to go to war, not when they decide to go to war. When God says, I want you to go to war, please help us and grant us victory against our enemies. So Christianity is not a pacifist religion. Now, it believes in a just war theory, and we can talk about that another time. So it's not that any military enterprise is justified, but there is such a thing as a just war, and when it meets biblical criteria. But here's the other point. The Second Amendment is actually rooted in the teaching of Jesus himself. This is what Jim Wallace, again, he's betraying his abysmal ignorance about theology, about the New Testament, about the teaching of Jesus Christ himself. This is from Luke 22. The very night that Jesus was betrayed, he told his disciples, look, this is right before he was betrayed and arrested, I am going to be numbered with the transgressors. This is a prophecy from Isaiah 53. It was fulfilled that weekend. He was indeed numbered with the transgressors. He was crucified with the transgressors, crucified between two thieves, between two rebels, between two insurrectionists, and everybody walking by would think he was one of them, that he was a bad actor, he was a bad guy, so he was numbered with the transgressors. And Jesus says to his disciples, look, you are identified with me. You follow me. You're known by my name, or you will be known by my name. And this means you are going to be numbered with the transgressors, just like we saw with being out in the boat. If you're with Christ in the boat, the enemy tries to come and destroy the boat. He's coming after you because you're with Jesus. So Jesus says the same thing. Look, I'm going to be numbered with transgressors. You're going to be numbered with transgressors. I mentioned that story. I've got it in the stack about this West Point think tank claiming that people who support natural marriage, the sanctity of life, and the Second Amendment, we are the terrorists that our government has to fear. In other words, what is West Point doing? They are numbering us as followers of Christ, numbering us with the transgressors. as if we represent the same threat to the peace and security of the United States that devout followers of Muhammad represent. It's absurd, but this is exactly what Jesus said would happen. You will be numbered with the transgressors just like I was. And so he says, look, because you're going to be numbered with the transgressors like I am, there may be a time when you will need to protect yourself, even using lethal force. And that's why he said, and is very unambiguous, let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. So he instructed his followers to arm themselves for their own defense. You don't have a sword, you're not packing, you're not strapped, sell your cloak if you have to and buy a sword. Get yourself armed in your own defense. Now, Jesus was clearly talking here about self-defense. There's nowhere where he says the kingdom of God advances at the point of a sword. That's how Islam advances. That's what Muhammad taught his followers to do, and they're still following that prescription today. That's why they attacked that oil facility in Algeria. By the way, a Canadian citizen who spoke with a North American accent, maybe even a Caucasian dude, a convert to Islam, the one who coordinated that attack. So Jesus said, no, this is for the purpose of self-defense, and this was the very reason that the founding fathers enacted the Second Amendment. Now, there's an interesting little wrinkle to what happened there. Remember, right after this, they're packing heat now, packing swords, their version of heat. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus is confronted and he's arrested, and Peter hauls out his sword and he takes a whack at one of the guards and cuts off his ear. And Jesus says literally in the Greek, you are permitted up to this point. Doesn't even rebuke Peter for swinging the sword. He says, in fact, Peter, you have my permission. I mean, the way the ESV translates it, no more of this, but literally in the Greek, it's you are permitted up to this point. That's literally what Jesus says according to the Greek. You are permitted up to this point. Peter, I've given you permission to use the sword in your own defense and in my defense up to this point. But now I want you to holster that thing. I'm going to stick the guy's ear back on his head. So this is the teaching of Jesus. Some will refer to the turn the other cheek, but that was a slap. You get slapped on the right cheek. It's got to be a backhand, not a closed fist. No prohibition against self-defense. Back in 2.